courthouse buzzed with quiet anticipation, the tension in the air as thick as the heavy oak doors that sealed the room from the bustling street outside. Jayla Robinson stood at the defendant's table, her head held high despite the judgmental stares and murmured whispers swirling around her. The faint clatter of keyboards and the shuffling of papers echoed in the cavernous space. At the opposite table, Officers Darren Brooks and Richard Connors sat with smug expressions, their confidence almost tangible. They knew they were in a courtroom where law enforcement rarely faced consequences. Jayla's pulse thrummed in her ears as the judge cleared his throat, ready to begin. His reputation preceded him, a strict judge known for siding with police officers in almost every case. "Miss Robinson," Judge Murdoch began, his sharp gaze boring into her, "you stand accused of resisting arrest, obstructing a police officer, and disorderly conduct. How do you plead?" Before Jayla's defense attorney could speak, Officer Brooks leaned over and whispered something to his attorney, prompting a smirk from the district attorney. Jayla caught the exchange and clenched her jaw, refusing to let the taunt shake her composure. The district attorney stepped forward, her voice steady and authoritative. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Miss Robinson behaved in a manner that was not only aggressive, but also posed a threat to the officers involved in the stop." The words hung in the air, and for a fleeting moment, Jayla felt her stomach twist, but she reminded herself why she was here, why she had fought to stand her ground. The district attorney continued, recounting the officer's version of events. Jayla had been speeding, refused to comply with their commands, and escalated the situation with hostile behavior. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery, fueled by the sensationalized description. Jayla's lawyer leaned in and whispered, "We'll turn this around when it's our turn." Jayla gave a slight nod, her face calm, but her mind raced back to the day it all started, the day everything spiraled out of control. A few weeks earlier. It had been a typical Thursday morning. Jayla woke before sunrise in her small but cozy apartment in Harlem. The city was just beginning to stir as she brewed a strong cup of coffee and glanced over her schedule for the day. She was a rising star at her law firm, known for her tenacity and sharp mind. Her docket was packed, but that wasn't unusual. Jayla thrived under pressure. She dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored navy slacks, her curly hair pulled into a neat bun. After slipping on her black heels, she grabbed her briefcase and headed out the door. Normally she'd take the subway to work, but she had a last-minute meeting in a neighboring district, so she decided to drive. Soft jazz played from the car's speakers as she navigated the morning traffic. The air was crisp, the sun casting a golden hue over the brownstone buildings lining the streets. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. That peace shattered when red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Jayla's heart skipped a beat as the blare of a siren filled the air. She quickly checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Confused but composed, she signaled and pulled over to the curb. Two officers approached her car. The taller one, Officer Darren Brooks, tapped on her window with a gloved hand. His partner, Officer Richard Connors, stood a few steps back, arms crossed. Jayla rolled down her window and offered a polite smile. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" Brooks didn't return her smile. His eyes narrowed as he scanned her face, then her car. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," he barked. Jayla complied without hesitation, handing over her documents. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "You were speeding," Brooks replied curtly. "Doing 45 in a 30. Jayla frowned. She was certain she hadn't been speeding. "Officer, with all due respect, I believe I was under the limit. Are you sure?" Brooks cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Step out of the car." Her stomach tightened. "Step out? Why?" Connors smirked from his position behind Brooks. "Are you resisting, ma'am?" "No," Jayla said firmly, "but I have the right to know why you're asking me to step out of my vehicle." Brooks leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Step out, or we'll make you step out." Jayla's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Years of legal training flashed through her mind. She knew her rights. She also knew how quickly situations like this could escalate. Reluctantly, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the pavement. A small crowd of pedestrians had begun to gather, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. Brooks grabbed her arm and spun her around, pressing her against the side of her car. The cold metal of the vehicle bit into her skin. "Is this really necessary?" Jayla asked, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. Connors began patting her down, his touch unnecessarily rough. "Gotta make sure you're not carrying anything illegal," he said with a smirk. Jayla bit her tongue, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She wasn't just an ordinary citizen. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but she wasn't ready to play that card just yet. "Stay quiet," Brooks ordered. "You're lucky we're letting you off with a warning." A warning for what? Jayla thought. She watched helplessly as Brooks rummaged through her car, tossing aside her neatly organized files. The humiliation stung, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Finally, Brooks slammed the car door shut. "Nothing here," he muttered to Connors. Connors chuckled. "Write her up for speeding and resisting." Jayla's head snapped up. "Resisting? I didn't resist anything." Brooks leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. "We'll see what the report says." The officers sauntered back to their cruiser, leaving Jayla standing on the sidewalk with a summons in her hand. She felt the eyes of the onlookers on her, their silent judgment cutting deeper than any words could. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with rage. The humiliation clung to Jayla like a suffocating blanket. As she stood on the sidewalk, watching the officers drive away, her fingers tightened around the summons. The words speeding and resisting arrest burned into her memory like a brand. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, the weight of the injustice pressing down on her chest. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, but it was the first time it had been so blatant, so unapologetic. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, their murmured words lingering in the air like a cloud of smoke. Jayla glanced at the summons again, her vision blurring with frustration. She could fight this. She would fight this. But not here, not in front of gawking strangers and biased eyes. With her chin held high, she climbed back into her car and drove off, her mind racing with 100 scenarios. She knew the officers' game. They were counting on her to be scared, to crumble beneath the weight of the false charges. But they had underestimated her. Jayla returned to her apartment and sat at her kitchen table, the summons spread out before her like a challenge. Her laptop hummed softly as she typed out a detailed account of the incident. Every word, every action, every microaggression meticulously documented. She cross-referenced her notes with legal statutes, building a mental map of how to counter the baseless charges. A thought struck her, and she picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name Marcus Green. Marcus was an old friend, a fellow attorney, and someone who had a deep understanding of civil rights law. If anyone could help her navigate this situation, it was him. "Marcus," she said when he answered, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I need your advice." Within minutes, they were deep in conversation, dissecting the situation from every angle. Marcus's voice was calm but tinged with concern. "These officers clearly thought they could intimidate you," he said. "They didn't know who they were dealing with, but be careful, Jayla. If they're willing to falsify charges, they won't stop there. We need to be strategic." Jayla nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'm not afraid of a fight, Marcus. I've been through worse. But I'm tired of staying quiet." Marcus paused, considering his next words carefully. "Then it's time to take control of the narrative. We'll gather evidence, find witnesses, and expose these officers for what they are. But we have to do it right. No missteps." The following week, Jayla found herself in the courthouse for her preliminary hearing. The grand, imposing building stood like a fortress against the skyline, its stone walls whispering promises of justice. or so she hoped. As she stepped inside, she felt the familiar weight of countless eyes on her. Whispers filled the gallery as spectators leaned in to get a better look at the young black woman standing before the court. At the prosecution's table, Officers Brooks and Connors sat with their attorney, their smug expressions unshaken. Jayla's lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Linda Porter, stood beside her. Linda was known for her sharp mind and relentless advocacy. She had taken on cases like this before, and she wasn't one to back down. "Stay calm," Linda whispered as they took their seats. "We're going to challenge everything they throw at you." The judge entered, his robes billowing as he settled into his chair. "Court is now in session," the clerk announced. The district attorney rose, her voice confident and commanding. "Your Honor, the prosecution will prove that Miss Robinson resisted a lawful order, obstructed officers in their duties, and behaved in a manner that warranted intervention." Jayla clenched her fists beneath the table. She could feel the injustice in every word, but she forced herself to stay composed. Linda stood next, her voice steady and authoritative. "Your Honor, we intend to show that my client was not only cooperative, but was subjected to an unlawful search and baseless accusations. The officer's actions were not only improper, but indicative of a troubling pattern of misconduct." The judge's eyes narrowed as he leaned back in his chair. "Proceed." The district attorney called Officer Brooks to the stand. He walked with a swagger, his every step radiating confidence. He recounted the incident in detail, painting Jayla as an aggressive, uncooperative individual who had refused to follow orders. His words were carefully chosen, his tone measured. Jayla watched him closely, her stomach twisting with each lie. Next, Officer Connors took the stand. His testimony echoed Brooks's, reinforcing the false narrative they had crafted. He added subtle details designed to discredit her, suggesting she had acted above the law. When Linda cross-examined him, her questions were sharp and pointed. "Officer Connors, did Ms. Robinson ever raise her voice or threaten you in any way?" "No," Connors admitted, his confidence wavering slightly. "Did she ever make any physical movement that could be perceived as aggressive?" Connors hesitated. "No, but—" "Thank you, officer," Linda cut him off, her smile cold. "No further questions." The tension in the room was palpable as Linda called Jayla to the stand. She walked calmly to the witness box, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Every eye in the courtroom followed her. Linda began her questioning with a gentle but firm tone. "Ms. Robinson, can you describe the events of that day in your own words?" Jayla nodded, her voice steady. "I was driving to a meeting when I was pulled over by Officers Brooks and Connors. I complied with every request, but they escalated the situation without cause. I asked why I was being searched, which is my right under the law. They ignored my question and proceeded to pat me down and search my car. When they found nothing, they issued me a summons for speeding and resisting arrest, charges that have no basis in fact." Linda continued, guiding Jayla through every detail of the encounter. Jayla recounted the officer's dismissive tone, the condescending comments, and the rough pat down. The courtroom was silent, every word hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Finally, Linda asked, "Miss Robinson, do you believe you were targeted because of your race?" Jayla hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I believe I was targeted because I am a black woman. I was treated with suspicion and hostility for no other reason than the color of my skin." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, the weight of her words sinking in. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Jayla's words lingered in the air like a thunderclap, their weight undeniable. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and the murmurs from the gallery grew louder. Even the smug expressions on Officers Brooks and Connors began to waver as they exchanged uneasy glances. Linda let the tension build before continuing. "Your Honor," she said, turning back to the judge, "I would like to submit evidence that directly contradicts the officer's testimony." The district attorney narrowed her eyes. "Objection, Your Honor. What evidence are we talking about?" Linda walked back to her table and picked up a USB drive. This is a video taken by a bystander showing a portion of the incident. It clearly demonstrates that Miss Robinson remained calm and compliant throughout the encounter. The judge glanced at the district attorney. Overruled. Let's see the video. Linda handed the drive to the bailiff, who inserted it into a laptop connected to the courtroom's display. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy but unmistakable footage of Jayla standing beside her car, arms raised, her expression calm but resolute. In contrast, Officer Connors could be seen roughly patting her down, while Officer Brooks rummaged through her vehicle. The room was silent except for the faint audio of Connors muttering, "They always think they're above the law." Jayla's heart thudded in her chest as the video played. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also empowered. This was the truth laid bare for everyone to see. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched the footage. When the video ended, he sat back, his expression unreadable. Linda turned toward Officer Connors. "Officer, would you care to explain the discrepancy between your testimony and the events in this video?" Connors cleared his throat, his face flushed. "The video doesn't show everything. It's taken out of context." "Out of context?" Linda pressed. "It shows you forcibly searching my client despite her full compliance. It also shows you making comments that suggest a bias against her. How is that out of context?" Connors opened his mouth, but no words came out. His attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client maintains that his actions were justified based on the circumstances." The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I'll decide what's justified." The power in the courtroom had shifted. The officers who once seemed so confident now appeared cornered. The gallery buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Jayla could feel the tide turning in her favor, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Linda continued her cross-examination, laying out a meticulously crafted argument. She revealed that both officers had prior complaints against them for misconduct, complaints that had been dismissed without investigation. The judge's eyes darkened. "I'd like to see the records on those complaints," he said, his voice low but firm. Linda nodded. "They're part of the official court documents, Your Honor." The district attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, I must object again. These complaints were unsubstantiated and irrelevant to the current case." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Unsubstantiated or ignored?" He tapped his gavel lightly. "I'll allow it." The courtroom grew tenser as Linda called her final witness, a retired officer named Daniel Hayes. Officer Hayes had worked with Brooks and Connors early in their careers and had grown disillusioned with their behavior. He had tried to file a report about their misconduct years ago, only to be silenced by his superiors. As he took the stand, Daniel looked around the courtroom, his eyes landing on Jayla. He nodded once, a silent gesture of support. "Mr. Hayes," Linda began, "can you tell the court about your experience with Officers Brooks and Connors?" Daniel cleared his throat. "I served with both officers for several years. In that time, I witnessed them targeting individuals based on race and fabricating charges to justify their stops. When I tried to report it, I was told to keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Linda asked gently. Daniel's eyes darkened. "Because the system protects its own. I regret staying silent for so long, but when I heard about what happened to Miss Robinson, I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression somber. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." He glanced at the district attorney. "I believe we've heard enough for today." The tension in the room was almost unbearable as the judge gathered his notes. Jayla's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Linda, who gave her a reassuring nod. Finally, the judge spoke. "I'll take the evidence under consideration and issue my ruling in due course. Court is adjourned." He banged his gavel, and the room erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and whispers. As Jayla and Linda made their way out of the courtroom, the officers' smug expressions were gone, replaced by barely concealed panic. Jayla caught Connors's eye and held his gaze for a moment before turning away, her head held high. Linda placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're not done yet," she said. "But we've turned the tide. You were brave today, Jayla. This fight isn't over, but you've taken control of your story." Jayla nodded, her pulse still racing. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." The courtroom hallway was buzzing with energy. Reporters, lawyers, and onlookers exchanged glances and hurried whispers, some clearly shocked by the revelations they had just witnessed. Jayla moved through the crowd with Linda by her side, determined to hold on to the strength she had shown inside. As they reached the steps outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit Jayla's face, warming her skin, but it did little to calm the storm still brewing inside her. Cameras flashed from all directions. Questions were being hurled at her like darts. "Ms. Robinson, how does it feel to confront these officers? Do you believe the judge will rule in your favor? Is this a case of racial profiling?" Jayla raised her hand, silencing the crowd with a calm yet powerful presence. Her voice was steady, yet every word carried the weight of what she had endured. "I trust the justice system to do what's right," she said. "No one, no matter who they are, should be treated as less than human. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been mistreated and ignored. This case is about accountability, and I believe the truth will prevail." The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and continued questions. Linda placed a firm hand on Jayla's arm, guiding her down the steps toward the waiting car. Once inside, Jayla exhaled deeply, her shoulders finally relaxing. "Not bad for your first public statement," Linda said with a smirk. "But things are going to get tougher from here. The media storm is just beginning." "I'm ready," Jayla replied, her voice resolute. "They can twist the story all they want. I know what happened, and I won't let them rewrite the truth." Back at home that evening, Jayla sat on her couch, scrolling through social media. Videos from the courtroom had already gone viral. Comment sections were flooded with debates, support, and criticism. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mother. "So proud of you. Stay strong. Love you always." A small smile touched Jayla's lips. Her mother's unwavering support had always been her anchor. It reminded her of why she was fighting so hard, not just for herself, but for her family and every person who had been silenced by injustice. She set her phone down and leaned back, eyes closed. Memories from her childhood washed over her. The lessons her mother had taught her about standing up for herself. The way her father used to remind her that her voice mattered even when the world told her otherwise. Those lessons felt more relevant than ever. The next morning, Jayla walked into Linda's office, prepared to discuss the next steps. Linda was already seated at her desk, surrounded by stacks of files and legal documents. She looked up and gestured for Jayla to sit. "I've been doing some digging," Linda began, sliding a folder across the desk. "It turns out our friends, Officers Brooks and Connors, have a pattern of behavior, multiple complaints, everything from harassment to unnecessary force, have been filed against them. Most were quietly dismissed." Jayla opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. Each complaint painted a picture that was all too familiar. Innocent people had been stopped, searched, and humiliated, just like her. "There's enough here to raise serious questions about their credibility," Linda continued. "And the fact that none of these complaints were taken seriously, that's a systemic issue." Jayla looked up, fire burning in her eyes. "Then we're not just fighting two officers, we're fighting an entire system that protects them." "Exactly," Linda said. "But we have something they didn't expect. You, your testimony, the video, and now this growing mountain of evidence. If we play this right, we can push for more than just clearing your name. We can make real change." The preliminary hearing resumed a week later. This time the courtroom was even more packed than before. The air was thick with tension as both sides prepared for what felt like a final showdown. The district attorney stood first, attempting to discredit the bystander video. She argued that it was incomplete and failed to show the entire encounter, once again painting Jayla as an uncooperative aggressor. But Linda was ready. She rose from her seat, her every step deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice strong and unwavering. "While the video may not capture the entire event, it clearly contradicts the officer's written statements. But more importantly, we have a witness. Mr. Daniel Hayes, a former officer who worked with both officers Brooks and Connors." All eyes turned to the door as Daniel entered the courtroom. His presence commanded attention, his every step measured and intentional. He walked to the stand, swore the oath, and looked directly at the judge. "Mr. Hayes," Linda said, "can you share your experience with the court?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I worked with officers Brooks and Connors for several years. During that time, I saw them engage in practices that were questionable at best and downright abusive at worst. When I tried to report them, I was silenced. I was told to keep my head down and stay out of it if I wanted to keep my job." A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. "Where are you coming forward now?" Linda pressed. "Because it's time," Daniel said, his voice steady. "People like Miss Robinson deserve better. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent any longer." The district attorney attempted to discredit Daniel, suggesting he was a disgruntled former employee with a personal vendetta. But Linda quickly dismantled those claims, presenting his spotless record and commendations from his years of service. The courtroom was electric with anticipation. Jayla could feel the shift in the room once again. The walls of the officers' lives were crumbling, brick by brick. When the judge called for a brief recess, Jayla and Linda stepped outside for fresh air. Jayla's pulse raced, her emotions a whirlwind of hope, anxiety, and determination. "This is it," Linda said, her eyes locking with Jayla's. "We've built a strong case. If the judge is fair, we have a real shot at turning this into something bigger." Jayla nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge returned to his bench. He shuffled through the papers before him, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air was almost tangible, pressing down on everyone present. Jayla sat calmly at the defense table, her eyes steady, her heart pounding beneath the surface of her composed exterior. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. After reviewing the evidence presented, including the testimony from Mr. Hayes, the video footage, and the record of prior complaints against officers Brooks and Connors, it is clear that there are significant inconsistencies in the officers' statements. These inconsistencies cast serious doubt on the credibility of their testimony and this entire case. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The district attorney shifted uncomfortably, whispering furiously to her assistants. Officers Brooks and Connors sat stiffly, their confidence drained, their smug expressions replaced by thinly veiled panic. Judge Whitmore continued, his tone firm. "I find it necessary to dismiss all charges against Miss Jayla Robinson. Furthermore, I will be referring this case to the Department of Internal Affairs for a full investigation into the conduct of officers Brooks and Connors. This type of behavior is deeply concerning and warrants further scrutiny." The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered while others whispered in shock. Jayla sat frozen for a moment, processing the weight of the judge's words. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, one of relief, triumph, and vindication. Linda leaned over, whispering, "We did it." Jayla nodded, her voice steady but emotional. "No, we all did it." As they stood to leave, the reporters outside wasted no time. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in their faces, and questions flew from all directions. "Miss Robinson, how do you feel about the judge's decision? Will you be pursuing further action against the officers? Do you believe this case will lead to police reform?" Jayla raised her hand to quiet the crowd. "Today's decision is a victory, Not just for me, but for everyone who has been treated unjustly. But let's be clear, this fight isn't over. Accountability must extend beyond this one case. We need real change in our systems to protect the vulnerable and ensure fairness for all." The applause that followed was deafening. Jayla turned to Linda, who gave her an approving nod. Later that evening, Jayla returned home, exhausted but exhilarated. She poured herself a cup of tea and sank into the couch, reflecting on everything that had happened. The battle had been long and draining, but she had stood her ground and refused to be silenced. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her mother. "Justice always wins. I'm so proud of you. Love you, sweetheart." Jayla smiled, her eyes misting over. Justice had won today, but it was just the beginning. Tomorrow, there would be more battles, more people who needed a voice, more systems that needed to be held accountable, and she would be there, ready to stand up for what was right. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, a moment of peace, a moment of victory. As Jayla walked out of the courthouse, the world outside felt different, brighter, lighter. The weight she had carried for days was finally lifted. People in the crowd began clapping, and several even approached her to shake her hand. Some offered words of encouragement, others shared their own stories of injustice, inspired by her bravery to speak up. "Thank you for standing up to them," said a woman holding her young son's hand. "You're giving people like me hope." Jayla smiled warmly. "We all deserve justice, no matter who we are. Never be afraid to speak your truth." Linda squeezed Jayla's shoulder as they made their way toward the waiting car. "You've become more than just a client today," she said with a proud grin. "You're a symbol of change now. This isn't the end, it's the beginning." They slid into the back seat, and as the car pulled away from the courthouse steps, Jayla gazed out the window. The city looked the same, but something in her heart had shifted. Her thoughts drifted back to the tense moments in court, the humiliating confrontation in the hotel lounge, and the determined stares from the officers who thought they could get away with it all. She had stood her ground, refusing to back down, refusing to accept that this was just how things were. The power she had felt in that moment, when she revealed her true identity, wasn't just about status. It was the realization that knowledge and courage could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of injustice. Later that evening, as Jayla sat on her balcony with a glass of wine, her phone buzzed with endless messages of support. Social media was on fire with hashtags like "Justice for Jayla" and "End Racial Bias" trending. Prominent activists, politicians, and everyday people had shared her story, turning it into a movement larger than she ever imagined. Jayla thought about how easily things could have gone another way. If she hadn't been persistent, if Linda hadn't believed in her and fought tirelessly, she might have been just another victim of an unjust system. It reminded her of something her father used to say. Courage isn't loud, it's steady. It's doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. For far too long, people like her had been forced to endure silent injustices, their voices drowned out by those in power. But today, she had proven that staying silent was no longer an option. There was too much at stake, not just for her, but for the countless others who lacked the resources or support to stand up for themselves. The fight was far from over, but the first victory had been won. This experience had given Jayla a new mission, one she couldn't ignore. She was going to dedicate her life to advocating for others, working towards systemic change, and helping to expose the hidden biases that still plagued society. The next morning, Jayla woke to a flood of emails and phone calls. Several law firms offered her positions, while community groups invited her to speak at events. The New York Times had even requested an exclusive interview, but none of that mattered as much as the email she received from the National Civil Rights Legal Fund offering her a position on their executive board. Jayla smiled to herself. This was the next step, the right step. Her skills, her passion for justice, everything she had learned through this experience would finally be put to use in ways that could help others on a much larger scale. Later that afternoon, she stood in front of a group of young law students at a community seminar, recounting her story. "Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Stand firm in who you are, know your rights, and most importantly, never be afraid to demand respect." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Miss Robinson, how did you stay so strong through everything?" Jayla paused, considering her answer. "I stayed strong because I knew the truth. And when you know the truth, it's a power no one can take away from you. They can try to intimidate you, to silence you, but as long as you hold on to that truth, you'll always have the upper hand." As she walked back to her car that evening, Jayla felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, she knew that, but she was ready. Her fight was just beginning, and this time she wasn't fighting alone. There were allies all around her now, ready to stand beside her and push for real change. And with that thought, Jayla drove into the fading light of the city, ready to take on whatever came next. If you found inspiration in Jayla's story, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and hit the subscribe button for more powerful stories of justice, courage, and change. Together we can create a world where everyone is treated with respect. See you in the next story.